The morning of December 7th, 1941 began like any other over the calm blue waters of Pearl Harbor. Within minutes, it became hell on earth. The first wave of Japanese aircraft roared out of the clouds, sleek Mitsubishi A6M Zeros glinting silver in the sun, slicing through the air with deadly grace. Their machine guns raked the decks of battleships and airfields. Their bombs shattered steel and silence alike. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet, the pride of the United States Navy, lay in ruins. Battleships burned, oil slicks turned the harbor black, and the sky itself seemed to belong to the rising sun. Across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Wake Island, Japan's air power struck with terrifying precision. And wherever the Zeros flew, American pilots discovered something even worse than defeat. They realized their planes couldn't match them. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outgun anything the U.S. had in the air. It was faster, lighter, and built for agility. The Americans, on the other hand, had entered the war with aircraft that many of their own pilots considered obsolete before the first shot was fired. Among these was a stubby, thick-bodied fighter with a round nose and a reputation as slow and clumsy, the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Even its name sounded ironic. There was nothing sleek or wild about it. Pilots called it the Ironworks Flying Barrel, a nod to its manufacturer's nickname, Grumman Ironworks, famous for overbuilt, indestructible planes. In the age of speed and finesse, it looked like a relic. Yet, as America reeled from disaster, this awkward, underrated little plane would soon carry the burden of holding the Pacific line alone. The Wildcat was never meant to be a hero. It was a compromise, a product of an earlier, cautious time. In the late 1930s, while Japan was already fielding fast monoplane fighters, the U.S. Navy still relied on biplanes like the Grumman F3F. When engineers at Grumman began sketching its replacement, they imagined something simple and tough, a single-engine monoplane that could take off from carriers, fold its wings for storage, and survive brutal naval operations. But the first prototypes, however, were a disaster. The Navy initially rejected Grumman's design in favor of the Brewster F-2A Buffalo, which looked faster on paper. The Buffalo went into production, and the Wildcat was shelved. But in test flights, the Buffalo proved fragile, unstable, and unable to withstand carrier service. Meanwhile, the engineers at Grumman, led by the stubborn, soft-spoken Leroy Grumman himself, refused to give up. They took their failed F4F back to the workshop, replaced the engine with a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830, strengthened the landing gear, added armor, and reinforced the self-sealing fuel tanks. The result was a compact, tough, and surprisingly lethal fighter. In 1940, when Europe was already burning and Britain was pleading for aircraft, the U.S. Navy took a second look. They needed something that could survive the pounding of carrier operations, and suddenly, the Wildcat's clunky durability looked like an asset, not a flaw. The first production model, the F4F3, entered service that year, armed with 4 .50 caliber Browning machine guns and a reputation for reliability. But the timing couldn't be worse. By the time the Wildcat reached the fleet in significant numbers, war had already come, and it would be thrown against the most dangerous fighter on Earth. When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, the Navy's carrier force, its one remaining offensive weapon, became the tip of America's counterattack. Yet the carriers had no choice but to send their squadrons into battle flying the Wildcat. It was underpowered, had no hydraulic folding wings, and climbed sluggishly compared to the Japanese Zero. Many pilots considered it a death sentence, but they had nothing else. At Wake Island, only 12 F4F3 Wildcats stood between hundreds of Japanese aircraft and an entire invasion fleet. When the attack began on December 8th, December 7th in Hawaii, the Wildcats scrambled into the sky under heavy bombardment. Against all odds, they fought back ferociously, diving into bomber formations, scoring hit after hit, sometimes even ramming when out of ammunition. In just 2 days, those 12 Wildcats destroyed over 24 Japanese planes before being overwhelmed. Every pilot who flew them knew the outcome was hopeless, but they fought anyway. The news of Wake Island's fall traveled across the Pacific like a funeral bell. Yet, within that defeat, something remarkable had emerged. Reports showed that the Wildcat, slow and outdated as it was, could still bring down the vaunted Zero if flown with discipline and courage. The myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked. Back in the United States, engineers pored over combat reports. They realized that while the Wildcat could not match the Zero's speed or turn rate, it could outdive it thanks to its rugged construction. Its armor gave pilots a fighting chance to survive hits that would have turned the Zero into a fireball. The aircraft that had been mocked as a stopgap was in reality the perfect weapon for the moment America needed most. Not elegant, but indestructible. The months that followed were dark ones for the Allies. The Philippines fell. Singapore fell. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. But somewhere in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, carrier groups like the USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown prepared for battle, their decks lined with rows of Wildcats. Their pilots trained relentlessly, learning to fight in pairs and cover each other's tails, developing new tactics that would later be known as the Thatch Weave. They didn't know it yet, but the age of American air power was about to begin, and it would begin not with a perfect machine, but with an imperfect one flown by men who refused to lose. For now, though, the Wildcat was still just the little fighter that had to. Its next test would not be survival, it would be redemption. Because soon, at a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific, the world would discover what happens when courage meets engineering in the sky above Midway. Long before the smoke of Pearl Harbor darkened the Pacific, the F4F Wildcat story began in the quiet hangars of Bethpage, Long Island, inside a small workshop run by the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation. In 1936, the U.S. Navy put out a call for a new carrier-based fighter. The days of biplanes were ending. The Navy wanted a monoplane with greater range, heavier guns, and a stronger frame to withstand the brutal impacts of carrier landings. Several companies competed for the contract: Seversky, Brewster, Vought, and Grumman. At the time, Grumman was known for its rugged but old-fashioned biplanes. Its chief designer, Leroy Grumman, was a practical man, an engineer who believed reliability mattered more than speed. His philosophy was simple: a fighter's first job is to bring its pilot home. The company's proposal, designated XF4F-1, was originally conceived as a biplane, just like its predecessor, the F3F. But when Brewster submitted a sleek all-metal monoplane called the F2A Buffalo, Grumman realized that the era of double wings was over. In a bold decision, they scrapped months of work and started again from scratch. The redesigned aircraft, XF4F-2, was a low-wing monoplane with retractable landing gear, a Grumman hallmark, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engine. But in 1938, the Navy tested both designs head-to-head. On paper, the Buffalo was faster, more aerodynamic, and easier to produce. It won the contract. The Wildcat was rejected. For most aircraft manufacturers, that would have been the end of the story. But for Grumman, rejection was only a challenge. Engineers Bill Schwendler and Bob Hall spent the next year reworking the Wildcat into a more powerful machine. They upgraded the engine, redesigned the tail for better control, and strengthened the airframe with heavier armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, the first American naval fighter to have both. They even redesigned the landing gear to fold into the fuselage manually, saving space on carrier decks. The result was the XF4F-3, a stocky, muscular fighter that looked more like a bulldog than a bird. In February 1939, the improved Wildcat took to the skies for the first time, and this time the Navy noticed. The F2A Buffalo, though faster, had begun to show fatal weaknesses. It overheated, its frame cracked under stress, and its landing gear buckled on carrier decks. In combat trials, test pilots preferred the ruggedness and firepower of the Wildcat. When World War II erupted in Europe that September, the Navy realized it needed a fighter that could survive long-term carrier service, not just win races on paper. By August 1940, the F4F Wildcat was officially accepted into U.S. NV service. Production ramped up at breakneck speed. Grumman's plant in Bethpage expanded into a 24-hour operation, nicknamed the Iron Works for its relentless output. The first deliveries went to Fighter Squadron 41, VF-41, aboard the USS Ranger, and VF-72, aboard the USS Wasp. Pilots initially mocked the aircraft's sluggish climb and short range, but they quickly came to respect its stability and durability. The F-4 could absorb incredible punishment. Bullets that would tear a Zero to shreds often barely dented its thick aluminum skin. But still, in American service, skepticism lingered. The F-4 wasn't fast. It wasn't elegant. It had no hydraulic folding wings, meaning it took up valuable space on crowded carrier decks. Pilots used to sleek Army fighters, like the P-40, called it a flying bathtub. Even Navy instructors half-joked that its biggest advantage was that it could take a lot of bullets before it got embarrassed enough to fall. But Grumman's engineers kept improving it. The F4F-4, introduced in early 1942, featured 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, folding wings for easier carrier storage, and better radio equipment. Its added weight made it slower, but the extra guns meant a Wildcat could shred any unarmored plane that dared fly too close. More importantly, by 1941, it was the only carrier-based fighter the Navy had in significant numbers. The Brewster Buffalo had been a disaster in combat, losing catastrophically to Japanese Zeros in Malaya and the Philippines. The Navy quietly pulled it from service. That left one machine, the Wildcat, to carry the burden of defending the Pacific. In hindsight, it seems inevitable, but in those months before Pearl Harbor, no one in the Navy believed this chunky underdog fighter would become the savior of American naval aviation. In simulator tests and training exercises, it routinely lost mock dogfights against Army planes. Commanders worried that in a real war, carrier pilots would be slaughtered. And yet, the Wildcat's greatest strength was hidden where few looked, in its design philosophy. It wasn't built for aerobatics or speed. It was built to survive. It had a thick, bullet-resistant windshield, armored pilot seat, and a self-sealing fuel tank that could take direct hits without turning the plane into a fireball. Its rugged landing gear could handle brutal carrier landings, and its wide wings made it stable even at low speeds. It was, in every sense, a pilot's airplane, forgiving, tough, and utterly reliable. In December 1941, when Japan struck across the Pacific, the Wildcat was no longer a prototype or an experiment. It was the only thing standing between the U.S. Navy and extinction. While new aircraft like the F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair were still months, even years away from deployment, the Wildcat would have to fight alone. It would have to protect America's carriers, defend island outposts, and go head-to-head with the most feared fighter in the world, the Mitsubishi A6M0. For its pilots, that knowledge was sobering. Many of them knew that in terms of raw performance, the Wildcat couldn't win a fair fight. But as one young Navy lieutenant aboard the USS Enterprise wrote in his diary before Midway, "They can turn tighter, they can climb higher, but they can't break us." In that single line lay the truth of the Wildcat's legacy. It was never the fastest, nor the prettiest. It was, however, the one that stayed in the fight. And as 1942 dawned, that would be enough. Because the next time the Wildcat rose into the sky, it wouldn't just be testing engines and guns. It would be defending a nation. The F4F Wildcat's first true test came not in a grand fleet battle, but on a tiny coral outpost in the middle of the Pacific, a speck called Wake Island. It was December 8th, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The news of Hawaii's devastation had barely reached the island when the sound of engines filled the sky again. This time, they weren't friendly. 12 Wildcats of Marine Fighting Squadron 211, VMF 211, scrambled from their small strip as Japanese bombers from the 24th Air Flotilla descended. The odds were hopeless. No radar warning, no reinforcements, no spare parts, and no illusions. The Marines knew they were on their own. In the first raid, most of the squadron's planes were caught on the ground, destroyed before takeoff. But the few that got airborne fought like cornered animals. They clawed their way into the sky, dove through bomber formations, and traded machine gun bursts with escorting Zeros. Major Henry T. Elrod, known to his men as Hammering Hank, became one of the first Marine aviators to destroy a Japanese warship from the air, dropping a 100-pound bomb on the destroyer Kisaragi, which exploded in a column of fire. For 15 days, the surviving Wildcats kept flying, patched together with scrap metal and fueled by desperation. Each day they rose into the burning sky. Each day fewer returned. When the Japanese finally overran the island, the last of the Wildcats lay silent, riddled with bullet holes and oil leaks, but beside them lay the wrecks of 24 Japanese aircraft. The Americans had lost Wake Island, but they gained something far greater. Proof. The Wildcat could fight. It could kill Zeros. It could take hits and still fly. The reports from Wake spread through the fleet like oxygen through fire. At a time when the word victory seemed foreign, the Wildcat had given the U.S. Navy hope. That hope was put to its ultimate test 6 months later, in June 1942, at Midway. The Japanese fleet that sailed eastward was the mightiest armada the world had ever seen. 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and the full confidence of an empire that had not yet lost a battle. The Americans, battered and outnumbered, had only 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the wounded Yorktown. Their fighter complement consisted almost entirely of F4F Wildcats. On June 4, 1942, just after dawn, the first wave of Japanese planes appeared over Midway Atoll. Wildcats scrambled from the island's runways, joined by those from the carriers offshore. Against them came the Zero, faster, lighter, and deadly. The early combat was brutal. Japanese pilots tore through the torpedo squadrons, annihilating entire units before they could release their payloads. Many Wildcat pilots watched helplessly as friends vanished in fireballs below. But from that chaos emerged a new kind of courage, one born not of superiority, but of discipline. A veteran pilot from VF-3, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch, had anticipated the Zero's agility. Months earlier, he had developed a new formation, the Thatch Weave, where 2 Wildcats flew in a crisscross pattern, covering each other's blind spots. When a Zero latched onto one plane's tail, the other would swing in to fire on the attacker. It was teamwork in motion, turning the Zero's speed against itself. At Midway, it worked to perfection. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later wrote that American pilots fought with cunning and discipline. Their planes were slower, but they were never alone. For the first time, Zero pilots found themselves caught in deadly traps. Wildcats that should have been easy kills became hunters. As dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found and destroyed the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the Wildcats above shielded them from interceptors, absorbing punishment that would have wiped out the strike. By the end of the day, Japan's elite carrier force was burning on the horizon, the same force that had once ruled the Pacific. Midway was more than a victory. It was a resurrection. And at its heart stood a machine once mocked as second-rate, the Wildcat. After the battle, when reports were compiled, the numbers told a story few believed possible. The Wildcat had a kill-to-loss ratio of nearly 1-to-1 against the Zero, an astonishing figure given its disadvantages. More importantly, its pilots were surviving. The Zero had no armor. A single hit often sent it flaming into the sea. The Wildcat, with its armored cockpit and sealed fuel tanks, brought its pilots home even when riddled with holes. Photographs taken aboard USS Enterprise showed Wildcats returning with tails shredded, wings perforated, and oil pouring from ruptured engines,
yet landing safely. That toughness earned the planes its reputation. Pilots began calling it the Iron Cat. Others, half in jest and half in reverence, called it the plane that wouldn't die. But toughness alone didn't win Midway. The Wildcat's real weapon had been the men inside it. Men like Thatch, who rewrote air combat doctrine, or Ensign Gay, who watched his entire torpedo squadron perish but stayed on course, or the Marine defenders at Midway Atoll, who flew until their ammunition ran dry. Together, they proved that victory in the air wasn't about who turned tighter, it was about who adapted faster. For Grumman's F4F, toughness was a noun for survival. By the summer of 1942, the F4F had transformed from a flying barrel into a symbol of defiance. Against an enemy that dominated the skies, it refused to yield. It had protected carriers, saved pilots, and bought time for the United States to rebuild, rearm, and retaliate. But the war was far from over. The next challenge would not come from open seas or long-range raids. It would come from the steaming jungles and deadly skies over a forgotten island called Guadalcanal, where the Wildcat would not just survive, but become a legend.
When the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, few of them knew the name of the fighter that would guard them from above. They only knew one thing. Every morning and every night, the sound of radial engines roaring over Henderson Field meant salvation. The men on the ground called it simply the Cactus Air Force, after the island's code name. To the Japanese, it was something else entirely, the stubborn American presence that refused to be erased. And at the center of it all was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Henderson Field was barely more than a strip of coral and dust hacked out of the jungle. It was bombed daily, shelled nightly, and soaked with tropical rain. The Wildcats that operated there, belonging to Marine Squadrons VMF-223, VMF-224, and later Navy units like VF-5, flew in conditions that no aircraft had been designed to endure. Mechanics worked ankle-deep in mud, patching bullet holes with tin, wiring together flaps with whatever scrap they could find. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks, fuel was rationed, and pilots often flew multiple sorties a day on little sleep and less food. The Japanese came in waves, bombers from Rabaul, escorted by elite Zero fighters from the Tainan Air Group. They had air superiority, experience, and momentum. The Americans had only grit. But what they lacked in numbers and technology, they made up for in tactics and toughness. Wildcat pilots learned to fight dirty, to dive instead of turn, to use their armor as an advantage. The mantra was simple: never dogfight a Zero, make him overshoot, then hit him when he climbs. One of the first to perfect this was Captain Marion E. Carl, who became the Marine Corps' first ace by shooting down Japanese aircraft over Guadalcanal. Another was Joe Foss, a lanky South Dakotan whose Wildcat bore the name Bat Out of Hell. Foss mastered hit-and-run attacks, striking from above and disappearing into clouds before Zeros could counter. By January 1943, he had downed 26 enemy planes, matching the record of the famed World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker. Foss's victories earned him the Medal of Honor, but to the Marines huddled in foxholes below, his real achievement was simpler. Every Zero he shot down was one less bomb falling on Henderson Field. Combat on Guadalcanal was personal. Pilots knew each other's names, faces, and empty bunks. Every loss was felt. The airstrip was small enough that a returning Wildcat could see the smoking crater where a friend's plane had failed to make it home. Yet even in this hellish environment, the aircraft's durability became almost mythical. Wildcats came back with holes the size of fists in their wings, chunks of the tail missing, or entire cylinders blown off the engine, and still landed. The Japanese, used to fragile but agile Zeros, were stunned. One captured pilot reportedly told his interrogators, "Your planes are made of steel. Ours are made of paper." Day after day, the sky over Guadalcanal became a proving ground for both men and machines. The Wildcats fought Zeros, bombers, and even ships,
strafing enemy convoys in the infamous Tokyo Express. Pilots launched before dawn, fought at noon, and landed in twilight on runways cratered with shell fire. Ground crews often risked their lives refueling and rearming planes during air raids, because if the Wildcats didn't fly, the Marines on the island would die. The Japanese called the skies above Guadalcanal the slot, a narrow corridor of death between jungle-covered islands where fighters and bombers clashed almost daily. The Wildcat owned it. Through sheer endurance and cooperation, the Cactus Air Force slowly turned the tide. By the end of 1942, Japanese bombers were losing entire squadrons just to reach the island. The balance of power in the Pacific Air War began to shift. The statistics tell one story. The men tell another. Pilots like Foss, Carl, and John L. Smith, who scored 19 victories, transformed the Wildcat from an underdog into a hero. Between August and December 1942, the Cactus Air Force claimed over 260 Japanese aircraft for the loss of just over 100 of their own, many of which were due to ground damage rather than combat. But every victory came at a cost. By late November, the airfield was a graveyard of wrecked Wildcats, their wings propped up on oil drums to be stripped for parts. Replacements were slow to arrive. The Hellcat and Corsair were still in testing. For months, the F4F carried the weight of the Pacific almost alone. It wasn't until February 1943, when the last Japanese troops evacuated Guadalcanal, that the pilots finally breathed easy. The island and the air above it belonged to the Allies. When the campaign ended, the Wildcat's record spoke for itself. It had held the line at Wake, survived Midway, and conquered Guadalcanal. It had faced the most advanced naval fighter of the Axis, and, through toughness, teamwork, and adaptation, had beaten it. But the war was changing. New, faster aircraft were already arriving at the front. The F-6F Hellcat, Grumman's new design, could finally outperform the Zero in every way. It was faster, climbed higher, and carried more guns. Many of its innovations, from its thick armor to its forgiving handling, were direct lessons learned from the Wildcat. Still, even as the Hellcat took the center stage, the F4F did not fade quietly. It continued to serve on smaller escort carriers, the baby flat tops, that provided air cover for convoys and amphibious landings. There, its compact size and rugged landing gear made it perfect for the rough decks of converted merchant ships. The Wildcat became the workhorse of the escort fleet, fighting U-boats in the Atlantic and kamikazes in the Pacific right up to 1945. When pilots look back, they didn't remember it as the prettiest plane, or the fastest, or even the deadliest. They remembered it as the one that got them home. As one Marine ace wrote after Guadalcanal, "The Zero danced around me like a butterfly, but my Wildcat could take a punch. When the fight was over, it was always me still flying." By the time the island was secure, the F4F had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of defiance, endurance, and the American spirit that refused to quit even when outgunned and outnumbered. The world now knew the truth. America's clumsy little iron cat had become the most respected predator in the Pacific.
When the guns fell silent over Guadalcanal, the world of naval aviation had already changed forever. The Wildcat, once dismissed as an obsolete relic, had done the impossible. It had held the line long enough for America to rebuild its fleets, its factories, and its faith. It had stood against the most feared fighter in the world and survived. It had bought time with blood, metal, and courage, and in war, time is victory. By 1943, the Navy's new generation of fighters was arriving in numbers. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair. They were faster, sleeker, and deadlier. Everything the Wildcat had never been. Yet every engineer and every pilot who touched those new planes carried lessons learned from the F-4F. The Hellcat, in particular, was a direct descendant. Laurie Grumman himself once said, "The Hellcat was born from the Wildcat scars."
The Wildcat's design philosophy, simplicity, survivability, and strength became the blueprint for all future carrier aircraft. Its self-sealing fuel tanks, armored cockpit, and reinforced landing gear became standard features. Its folding wing mechanism, perfected on later variants, revolutionized carrier operations, allowing more planes to be stored and launched from a single deck. Even its tactical influence endured. The thatch weave, first tested in the Wildcat, remained a staple of air combat doctrine for decades. But even as newer aircraft took the spotlight, the F4F refused to retire quietly. It found a second life on the Navy's escort carriers, smaller, slower vessels known affectionately as jeep carriers. On these cramped decks, the Wildcat's short wingspan, manual gear, and rugged frame made it invaluable. Pilots who transitioned to the F6F often joked that the Wildcat was like an old friend with ugly shoes, not much to look at, but always there when you needed him. In the Atlantic, Wildcats hunted German U-boats, flying long anti-submarine patrols with depth charges and rockets slung under their wings. In 1944, F4Fs from escort carriers like the USS Bogue and Card helped close the deadly gap in the mid-Atlantic, protecting convoys and sinking dozens of enemy submarines. In one famous action, Wildcat spotted and forced the U-boat U-118 to the surface, guiding destroyers in for the kill. A reminder that even in the age of jets and bombers, courage and craftsmanship still mattered. In the Pacific, Wildcats continued to fly close air support missions for Marines landing on island beaches from Tarawa to Iwo Jima. Their ruggedness, once mocked, became their greatest asset. A Wildcat could take off from a short deck, absorb enemy fire, and still deliver its payload. The Navy even introduced a lighter, improved version built under license by General Motors, the FM2 Wildcat, with a more powerful engine and taller tail for stability. It became the unsung hero of countless operations, defending transport ships and supporting amphibious assaults long after its successors had moved on to glory. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, over 7,800 Wildcats had been built. They had served with the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, and even the Royal Canadian Navy. They had fought across the globe, from the Arctic convoys to the Coral Sea, and their pilots had achieved something few could have imagined in 1941, an overall kill ratio better than 6-to-1 against the Japanese. But numbers alone don't tell the Wildcat story. Its true legacy lies in what it represented: resilience. In an age when sleekness and speed seemed to define victory, the Wildcat proved that survival and stubbornness could win wars too. After the war, many Wildcats were scrapped, their metal recycled to build the peace they had earned. A few were sold to training schools, others displayed in museums or forgotten in hangars. Yet some survived, lovingly restored by veterans and aviation enthusiasts who refused to let history rust away. When their engines roar to life today at air shows, the sound is unmistakable. That deep, throaty growl of the Twin Wasp radial engine, the same sound that once echoed over Wake, Midway, and Guadalcanal. For the pilots who flew it, the Wildcat was more than just an airplane. It was a companion in the loneliest moments of their lives. Many remembered it as the plane that taught them how to fight, how to adapt, and how to endure. The Wildcat never quit on me, so I never quit on it, one Navy ace said. Its influence extended far beyond World War II. The lessons learned from the F4F's rugged design and naval practicality shaped generations of carrier aircraft, from the Hellcat and Corsair to the F-14 Tomcat decades later. Each carried a piece of the Wildcat's DNA, that marriage of toughness, simplicity, and loyalty to the man in the cockpit. Strategically, the Wildcat's role cannot be overstated. It held the Pacific together during the most fragile period of the war, when the U.S. Navy had no replacements, no reserves, and no second chances. Without the Wildcat stand in 1942, the carriers might have been destroyed, the Pacific might have been lost, and the great American counteroffensive that followed might never have happened. Even the enemy respected it. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who fought Wildcats over the Solomons, later wrote, "The American Grumman was not fast, but it was strong. The pilot who flew it trusted his machine completely. That was its greatest strength." In the end, the Wildcat story is not one of perfection, but of perseverance. It began as a rejected prototype, flew into history as an underdog, and emerged as one of the most important fighters of World War II. It never dominated the skies through speed or grace, but through willpower, the same willpower that turned defeat into defiance, and defiance into victory. Today, a handful of F4F Wildcats still fly, their polished wings gleaming under the sun at airshows from Oshkosh to Duxford. When they lift off the runway, their shadow stretches long, a shadow not of failure, but of endurance. As their engines thunder across the crowd, one can almost imagine the echo of another time, the distant cries of battle, the flash of tracers over the Pacific, and the stubborn little fighter that refused to die. It was never the prettiest, never the fastest, and never the most feared. But it was, beyond question, the fighter that saved the Pacific.